The divorce papers landed on the mahogany table with a heavy thud that silenced the entire room. At 7 months pregnant, I sat frozen in the golden dining room of Sterling Manor while my mother-in-law stared at me with pure malice. She thought she was crushing a helpless orphan to protect her family fortune. She had no clue that the trembling woman before her was actually the sole heir to a media empire worth billions. My name is Sarah, and sitting in the dining hall of Sterling Manor felt less like a Thanksgiving celebration and more like an execution waiting to happen. Outside the thick glass panes of the Hamptons estate, the November gale howled off the Atlantic Ocean. It rattled the frames with a violence that made the crystal chandelier above us tremble. Inside, the fireplace roared with logs that cost more than my old rent, but the heat never seemed to reach me. The air in the room was absolute zero. I sat squeezed between a hedge fund manager and a corporate lawyer, feeling small despite the 7-month swell of my belly. The chair was antique mahogany and unforgiving against my aching spine. Every detail of the table setting was designed to intimidate. The sterling silver knives were polished to a mirror shine that distorted my reflection into something frightened and pale. The centerpieces were white roses forced into rigid, unnatural spheres where not a single petal dared to be out of place. It was beautiful and dead, just like the atmosphere in this house. Beatrice Sterling sat at the head of the table like a queen presiding over her court. She wore a dress of midnight blue velvet and a necklace of diamonds that caught the candlelight with cold indifference. She did not seem to be eating. Instead, her eyes were fixed on me. She tracked my fork as it moved from the plate to my mouth. She watched the way I wiped the corner of my lips. It was a predatory gaze that stripped away my confidence layer by layer. She was looking for a crack in my armor. She was waiting for the orphan girl to mess up. I turned slightly toward my husband, seeking an anchor in the storm. "Mark," I whispered, hoping he would hear the desperation in my voice. He did not look up. Mark kept his head bowed. His eyes were glued to the phone he had concealed in his lap under the linen napkin. His thumb scrolled incessantly. I could see the tension in his jaw and the way a vein pulsed at his temple. He was physically present, but he had abandoned me in this arena long ago. The conversation around the table flowed like a river I was not allowed to enter. They spoke of a merger involving $300 million in assets. They debated the tax implications of the new bill in the Senate. They dropped names of politicians and CEOs like currency. Whenever I tried to smile or nod to show I was following along, they would simply look through me and turn their shoulders to close the circle. I was the wife of the heir, but in their eyes I was just a temporary fixture, a mistake that had lingered too long. A sudden cramp seized my lower back. It was a sharp, biting pain that made me gasp softly. The baby kicked hard against my ribs. Even my unborn child could feel the toxicity in this room. My heart rate spiked, and a wave of dizziness washed over me. I needed to calm down for the baby's sake. I reached for my water goblet. My hand shook slightly, and the ice cubes chimed against the crystal. The sound was deafening in the lull of conversation. Aunt Clara, a distant relative with a face like a dried apple and eyes like beads of glass, set her wine glass down. She looked at Beatrice and then swiveled her gaze to me. "It is fascinating how the sterling nose has dominated the family portraits for 100 years, Clara said with a smile that did not reach her eyes. One hopes the new edition will inherit the strong features, though I suppose with mixed inputs, one never knows what one will get. The table went quiet. The insult was wrapped in silk, but it cut deep. She was talking about my unknown parents, my lack of pedigree. "I am sure the baby will be healthy," I said. My voice sounded thin and weak to my own ears. Clara tilted her head. "Health is one thing dear. Heritage is another. It must be so confusing for you to be here, among people who actually know who their great-grandparents were." I gripped the stem of my glass until my knuckles turned white. I wanted to scream that my blood was just as red as theirs. I wanted to tell them that dignity was not something you inherited from a trust fund, but I stayed silent. I took a sip of water and let the cold liquid numb the burning in my throat. I sat back and wrapped my arms protectively around my stomach. I was alone in a room full of people. The aroma of roasted turkey and sage filled the room as a procession of servers entered through the double doors carrying heavy silver platters. It was the centerpiece of the Thanksgiving feast, a bird so large it looked grotesque under the chandelier lights, just as the head waiter prepared to carve. Beatrice raised a single manicured hand. The gesture was small but commanding. The staff froze instantly. They stepped back into the shadows and left the steaming food untouched on the sideboard. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the table. It was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a held breath before a scream. Beatrice did not pick up her wine glass. She folded her hands on the table and looked around at her family, letting her gaze linger on the portraits of ancestors lining the walls. "We gather here to give thanks," Beatrice began, her voice smooth and cultured, masking the venom underneath. "But we must also reflect on our duty. The Sterling legacy is not merely about the assets we hold in the bank. It is about the integrity of our name, the purity of our bloodline. We have a responsibility to prune the garden, lest the weeds choke out the roses." The metaphor was clumsy, but the intent was razor-sharp. Every head at the table turned slowly toward me. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands started to tremble in my lap, and I clutched the fabric of my maternity dress as if it were a lifeline. I was the weed. I was the contamination they needed to purge. Beatrice reached under the table and produced a thick, cream-colored envelope. She dropped it onto the polished mahogany surface. The sound was a dull, heavy thud that echoed through the room like a judge's gavel sentencing a prisoner. "Mark," I whispered, turning to him again. My husband refused to meet my eyes. He stared at his empty plate, his face pale and slick with sweat. His hands were gripping his linen napkin so tightly that his knuckles were white, but he remained motionless. He was a statue of cowardice. "This marriage," Beatrice said, pointing a finger at the envelope, "was a momentary lapse in judgment, a youthful indiscretion that has unfortunately dragged on for 2 years, but we are correcting it tonight." She looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust. "We know what you are. Sarah, a desperate girl from nowhere who saw a vulnerable boy and sank her claws in. You thought that getting pregnant would secure your position? You thought a child would be your golden ticket into this family." I felt like I had been slapped. The air left my lungs. "That is not true," I stammered, my voice shaking uncontrollably. "I love Mark. I have never asked for a penny from you. I don't care about the money." "Please spare us the theatrics," Beatrice cut in, her voice rising just enough to drown me out. "Love is a luxury for people who can afford it. You are here for the lifestyle. You are a parasite." I looked around at the table, begging with my eyes for someone, anyone, to speak up. Aunt Clara was inspecting her fingernails. The cousin across from me took a sip of water, looking bored. They did not see a pregnant woman being abused. They saw a problem being solved. I was a foreign object in their perfect organism, and the immune system was attacking. Beatrice pushed the envelope across the smooth wood until it stopped inches from my hand. "These are divorce papers," she stated coldly. "You will sign them now. If you do, we will provide a small settlement to help you. Disappear. If you refuse, I will make sure you are destroyed. You will leave this house with nothing. No money, no reputation, and certainly no child." I turned my entire body toward Mark. The mahogany chair scraped loudly against the floorboards, a jarring sound that made several guests wince. But I did not care about etiquette anymore. I needed my husband. I reached out and grabbed his hand, my fingers digging into his skin, desperate to feel a pulse, a reaction. Anything that proved the man I married was still in there. Mark. "Look at me," I pleaded, my voice cracking under the weight of my terror. "Tell her she is wrong. Tell her about the nursery we painted. Tell her about how much we love this baby. Please. Mark, say something." Mark slowly pulled his hand away from mine. He did not yank it. He simply withdrew it with a limp, pathetic slide that hurt worse than a slap. He finally lifted his head, but his eyes were vacant, like the shutters had been pulled down on his soul. "Mother is right. Sarah," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of the warmth that used to greet me every morning. I stared at him, my mouth slightly open, unable to process the betrayal. "Right," I whispered. "She wants to destroy us. She wants to save the company," Mark replied, reciting the lines as if he had memorized them from a script. "Your emotional instability. It has been a distraction. The board is concerned. My focus has drifted, and the quarterly figures are down. We cannot afford that risk right now." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The man I loved, the man whose child I carried, was talking about our marriage like it was a failing subsidiary that needed to be liquidated. I looked at his face, really looked at him, and for the first time, I did not see a partner. I saw a hollow shell, a puppet with strings that led directly to the diamond-encrusted fingers of the woman at the head of the table. Beatrice did not give me time to recover from the heartbreak. She signaled to a server who stepped forward with a stack of black folders. "Mark has been too kind to mention the specifics," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "But we have documented everything. Your erratic behavior, your outbursts. It is clear you are suffering from severe prepartum psychosis. You are not fit to be a mother." She slid the folders down the table. The guests picked them up with eager, voyeuristic hands. I watched in horror as my private life was fabricated and dissected before my eyes. "These are fake," I screamed, struggling to stand up, but the weight of my belly pulled me back down. "I never wrote those emails. I have never seen that therapist. The records speak for themselves," a cousin muttered, scanning a page that looked like a medical evaluation. "Paranoid delusions, violent mood swings. It says here you threatened self-harm 2 weeks ago." "No," I gasped, feeling the walls closing in on me. "That is a lie, Mark. Tell them you were with me 2 weeks ago." Mark looked at the tablecloth, refusing to witness my unraveling. The guests whispered among themselves, nodding in agreement with the forged papers. They looked at me not with pity, but with the clinical detachment one might have for a rabid animal. I felt stripped naked. Every layer of my dignity was being peeled away, leaving me raw and exposed in the center of this opulent dining room. Suddenly, a violent jolt hit my rib cage. The baby kicked. It was a powerful, frantic movement, as if my son could feel the surge of cortisol flooding my bloodstream. He was thrashing inside me, sharing my panic. I clutched my stomach, trying to soothe him, trying to protect him from the poison in the air. "He is scared," I said, tears streaming down my face. "You are scaring him." Mark looked at my stomach then, his gaze lingering for a second before hardening again. "That is exactly why we are doing this," Mark said, and his tone was chillingly reasonable. "It is best for the child. Sarah. He needs stability. He needs the sterling environment. He cannot be raised by someone unstable. When you sign the papers, you agree to full custody for us. We will raise him. We will fix the damage you might cause." I froze. The betrayal was absolute. He did not just want to leave me. He wanted to steal the only thing that mattered. He wanted to take my son and turn him into another cold, heartless statue to place in this mausoleum of a house. I stared at the black ink of the divorce decree until the letters blurred before my eyes. The sheer audacity of her demand sparked a fire in my chest that burned through the fear. I shoved the paper back across the polished mahogany table with a force that rattled the silverware. "No," I said, my voice gaining a tremor of strength born from pure maternal instinct. "I will not sign this. You can take the house. You can take the status. But you are not taking my son. I will fight you." Beatrice threw her head back and laughed. It was a dry, brittle sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "Fight us?" she asked, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "With what army? With what funds? You are a nobody." She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing into slits. "My dear, I have already retained the services of the most aggressive family law firm in Manhattan. They have drafted the emergency custody order. The moment that child takes his first breath, he becomes a ward of the Sterling family." "You can't," I gasped, my hand flying to my mouth. The law protects children from dangerous mothers," she interrupted, cutting me off effortlessly. She tapped the fake medical file with a long, manicured fingernail. "This folder proves you are mentally unstable. It proves you have violent tendencies. No judge in this state will let you within 50 feet of an infant. We will argue that you are a threat to his safety. And we will win." The air seemed to vanish from the room. My chest tightened until it felt like an iron band was crushing my ribs. I looked at the file, the pile of lies that would steal my baby. I imagined a life where I never held him, never fed him, never saw his first step. The panic was physical, a wave of nausea that made the room spin. "This is insane," I wheezed, clutching my throat as I struggled for air. "Mark, she is talking about stealing our son. Look at me." A man at the far end of the table, Uncle Julian, cleared his throat nervously. He adjusted his glasses, looking uncomfortable. "Beatrice," he murmured, his voice tentative. Perhaps this is a bit too much. Surely we can come to an arrangement without taking the child from his mother." Beatrice turned her head slowly. Her eyes snapped to him like a viper striking its prey. "Be silent, Julian," she commanded, "unless you wish for the audit committee to look closely at your branch's expenses from the last quarter." Julian paled instantly. He shrank back into his chair, effectively silenced. The message was clear to everyone in the room. No one was safe from her wrath if they stepped out of line. Beatrice turned back to me, her expression victorious. "Here is your reality. Sarah, you have two choices. Option 1. You sign the papers right now. You admit to the infidelity and the fraud we have fabricated. In exchange, I give you a check for $10,000 and a bus ticket. You walk away, and you never speak to us or the press again." And option 2, I asked, tears dripping off my chin onto the tablecloth. "Option 2, she hissed, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "You refuse. We take the baby immediately upon birth. Then, I press charges for financial fraud and embezzlement. I have planted enough evidence in your personal accounts to put you in federal prison for 10 years. You will give birth in handcuffs, Sarah, and you will rot in a cell while I raise your son to forget you ever existed." I looked at Mark one last time. He was the father of my child. He was the man who had whispered promises of forever in my ear on our wedding day. Now, faced with his mother's monstrous ultimatum, he did nothing. He stared at the floral centerpiece, his silence a deafening roar that shattered whatever love I had left for him. He was not a victim here. He was a willing accomplice. The dining room walls felt like they were closing in, the gold leaf trim turning into the bars of a cage. I was trapped. I had no phone, no allies, and no way to prove my innocence before they destroyed me. I was cornered like a frightened animal, and they were holding the knife. I swept my gaze across the room one last time, taking in the gilded cage that had been my home. The crystal chandeliers mocked me with their brilliance, and the silent, judging faces of the guests, formed a wall I could not breach. In this specific moment, within these four walls, I was completely powerless. They had the lawyers, the connections, and the ruthlessness to bury me. If I tried to fight them right now, with no access to my own resources and no phone to call for help, I would lose. I would end up in a jail cell, and my son would be raised by the very woman who called him a mistake. A hot, heavy tear escaped my eye and fell straight onto the divorce decree. It soaked into the expensive cream paper, blurring the sharp black letters of the legal text that declared my marriage void. I stared at the wet spot, watching the ink bleed slightly. I placed my hand gently over my belly, feeling the solid, reassuring curve of it. "I am sorry, my baby," I whispered, barely moving my lips so the vultures around the table could not hear me. "I have to do this. I have to get us out of here. It is just a retreat, not a surrender." My hand trembled violently as I reached out for the heavy gold fountain pen lying on the mahogany table. It felt cold to the touch, heavy and substantial like a weapon. I gripped it tight, my knuckles turning white. I looked up and met Beatrice's eyes. She was watching me with a look of supreme triumph. She sat back in her high-backed chair, a smug smile curling her lips. She believed she had finally broken me. She thought she was watching the total collapse of a helpless orphan who had dared to reach above her station. She had no idea that by forcing my hand, she was actually setting me free. I pressed the gold nib to the paper. The scratching sound seemed deafening in the silent room. "Sarah," I wrote my first name slowly. "Sterling." I hesitated for a fraction of a second before finishing the signature. Each loop of the letters felt like a knife cutting through my chest, severing the hopes and dreams I had once held for this family. It was physically painful, a visceral tearing of the bond I had tried so hard to protect. But as I dotted the I and lifted the pen, a sudden, unexpected wave of relief crashed over me. I let the pen drop from my fingers. It clattered loudly against the wood and rolled away. I slumped back in my chair, exhaling a breath that rattled in my chest. It was done. The lie was over. The heavy burden of trying to please these people, of trying to be worthy of Mark's love, was gone. I was no longer the unwanted daughter-in-law. I was just Sarah, and for the first time in 2 years, I felt a flicker of my old self returning. Beatrice did not wait a single second. Her hand shot out like a cobra and snatched the document from the table. She brought it close to her face, scanning the signature to make sure I had not tried any tricks. Satisfied, she folded the paper and tucked it into the bodice of her dress, patting it like a prized possession. She let out a laugh that was devoid of any warmth. It was a sound of pure victory. "Finally," Beatrice said, looking around the table with a bright, terrifying smile. That was necessary unpleasantness. "But it is done." She turned to the head waiter who was standing in the shadows, trying to make himself invisible. "James," she commanded, waving her hand carelessly in my direction as if I were a pile of dirty napkins. "Clean up this mess. Remove the extra place setting. We are ready for the turkey now. The appetite tends to improve significantly when the garbage is taken out." Mark picked up his wine glass and drained it in one go, his eyes fixed firmly on the floral centerpiece. He wiped his mouth with his hand, still refusing to look at the woman he had just discarded. I sat there, feeling the air shift around me, watching the servants step forward to erase my existence from the Sterling family table. Beatrice sat there with that smug look, waiting for the final act of my humiliation. She expected me to curl into a ball and beg for mercy. She expected the broken girl she had bullied for 2 years to dissolve into a puddle on her expensive Persian rug. But as the ink dried on the paper, something inside me snapped back into place. It was like a dormant engine roaring to life. I reached up and wiped the tears from my cheeks with the back of my hand. The motion was rough and deliberate. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cold air of the room, and I stood up. The chair legs made a sharp sound against the floor, but this time I did not flinch. I placed my hands flat on the table and leaned forward, locking eyes with the matriarch of the Sterling family. I saw a flicker of confusion cross her face. She had never seen me look at her like this before. "You think this piece of paper destroys me," I said, my voice steady and clear, carrying to every corner of the silent room. "You think you have discarded trash. But you are wrong. Beatrice, this is not my end. This is my liberation." The silence that followed was absolute. The guests stopped chewing. The servers froze in the shadows. I turned my head slowly to look at the man sitting next to me. Mark was still staring at his hands, trying to make himself disappear. "Mark," I said. I did not shout, but my tone demanded attention. He flinched and slowly lifted his head. His eyes were red and watery, filled with a pathetic mixture of guilt and relief. "You are a coward," I told him, letting the words hang in the air. "I spent 2 years trying to be the perfect wife for you. I defended you. I loved you. And in the moment when your son needed you the most, you chose your mother's bank account. Sarah, please," Mark whispered, his voice cracking. "I had no choice. You always have a choice," I snapped. "You just made the wrong one. You do not deserve to be a father. You have lost the right to even speak his name." "You think you saved your inheritance, Mark? You just lost the most valuable thing you will ever have." A ripple of shock went through the room. Aunt Clara gasped audibly. The hedge fund manager's mouth hung slightly open. They were witnessing the transformation of a doormat into a wall of steel. Beatrice slammed her hand down on the table, her face twisting into a mask of fury. "That is enough," she shrieked. "She is delirious." The stress has clearly broken her mind. Someone get her out of here before she embarrasses herself further. She looked around for the security guards, her composure cracking for the first time. "I am not crazy. Beatrice," I said, smiling coldly. "I am the sanest person in this room. Do you know why I stayed? Do you know why I endured your insults and your snide comments for 24 months? Because I wanted my son to have a family. I grew up without one, and I wanted him to have cousins and grandparents and a legacy." I looked around the table at the faces of the people who had watched me bleed without lifting a finger. "But I see now," I continued. "This is not a family. This is a viper's nest. This house is toxic. If I raised my son here, he would turn into a monster like you. I am not losing a family. Beatrice, I am saving my child from one." "Get out!" Beatrice screamed, pointing a shaking finger at the door. "Leave my house. You have nothing. You are nothing." I straightened my back, feeling the strength of my ancestors surging through my veins. "I am leaving," I said calmly, "but I am not leaving empty-handed. You think I am walking out of here a destitute orphan? You think you can silence me with a $10,000 check I am taking the truth with me? And the truth is going to burn this house to the ground." Beatrice opened her mouth to retort, but the words died in her throat. A low, rhythmic thumping sound began to vibrate through the floorboards. It started as a distant hum but grew rapidly into a deafening roar. The crystal glasses on the table began to dance and clink together. The silverware rattled against the china. The noise became overwhelming, drowning out the storm outside. A brilliant white spotlight cut through the darkness of the night, sweeping across the French windows and flooding the dining room with a blinding glare. "What in the world?" Uncle Julian stammered, covering his ears. The entire house seemed to shake as a massive helicopter descended onto the great lawn, its rotors churning the air with the force of a hurricane. The wind from the blades slammed against the glass, making the heavy curtains sway wildly. The Sterling family looked at the windows in terror, but I just watched the light, knowing that my real life had finally arrived. The downdraft from the machine outside was so powerful that it whipped the freshly fallen snow into a frenzy, slamming it against the glass like thousands of tiny, icy fists demanding entry. The serene, stifling atmosphere of the dinner party was shattered instantly. The double doors at the far end of the room burst open with a violence that made the heavy oak frames shudder. Henderson, the head of the Sterling security detail, stumbled into the room. He was a large man who usually exuded arrogance, but right now his face was flushed with panic and his earpiece was dangling loose against his collar. Mrs. Sterling Henderson shouted over the mechanical thrum outside, "We have a breach unidentified aircraft on the south lawn. They are armed and they ignored all warnings to—" He never finished his sentence. Two figures dressed in sharp black suits moved past him with the fluid, lethal grace of predators. They were not ordinary bodyguards. They moved with military precision. One of them clamped a hand on Henderson's shoulder and guided him firmly to the wall, neutralizing the threat without even drawing a weapon. The other stepped to the side of the doorway and stood at attention, his eyes scanning the room behind dark sunglasses even though it was night. Then, the man they were protecting stepped across the threshold. The air in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and imposing, wearing a long charcoal wool coat that swirled around his legs like a storm cloud. His silver hair was swept back, and his face was carved from granite, marked by deep lines of authority and a ruthlessness that had become legendary on Wall Street. It was Richard Vance. The Richard Vance, the CEO of Vance Global, a conglomerate so massive it could swallow the Sterling family business whole without even burping. A collective gasp went around the table. The hedge fund manager dropped his fork, the clatter sharp and loud in the sudden hush. He knew exactly who had just walked in. Everyone did. Richard Vance was not a man you invited to dinner. He was a man who bought the restaurant while you were eating. Beatrice stood frozen at the head of the table. Her eyes went wide, the pupils dilating in genuine terror. Her hand, which had been poised to take a sip of her vintage Bordeaux, went slack. The crystal goblet slipped from her fingers. It hit the edge of the table and shattered, sending a cascade of dark red liquid splashing across the pristine white tablecloth and dripping onto the expensive cream carpet. It looked like a gunshot wound spreading across the fabric. Richard did not look at the broken glass. He did not look at the terrified guests or the trembling matriarch. He did not even spare a glance for Mark, who was shrinking into his chair as if trying to merge with the upholstery. His steel gray eyes were locked onto one person only. Me. He strode across the room, his heavy footsteps echoing with purpose. He moved like a force of nature, parting the sea of stunned socialites. When he reached me, the hardness in his face fractured, revealing a depth of pain and tenderness that no one else in the world had ever seen. He saw my tear-streaked face. He saw the way I was clutching my belly. He saw the divorce papers lying on the table where Beatrice had left them. Without a word, he unbuttoned his heavy wool coat and shrugged it off his shoulders. He draped it around me, engulfing my shivering frame in his warmth and the scent of cedar and expensive tobacco. It felt like armor. It felt like home. He placed his large, warm hands on my shoulders, grounding me, stopping the tremors that were racking my body. He looked deep into my eyes, ignoring the chaos he had caused, ignoring the security guards and the screaming wind outside. Sarah. His voice rumbled, deep and resonant, cracking slightly with emotion. My daughter. Have you endured enough? I looked up at him, the man I had run away from to prove I could make it on my own, the man whose protection I had scorned because I wanted to be loved for myself, not my name. I realized then how foolish I had been. Yes, I choked out, a fresh wave of tears spilling over my lashes, but these were not tears of despair. Yes, Dad, please take me home. Richard nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. He turned his head slightly, his profile looking like a hawk spotting prey, and for the first time, he acknowledged the rest of the room. The temperature seemed to plummet again as his gaze landed on Beatrice. The word Dad hung in the air like a thunderclap that refused to fade. A ripple of murmurs broke out among the guests as the realization hit them with the force of a physical blow. The pieces fell into place. The mysterious background, the lack of known relatives, the quiet dignity that no amount of abuse could fully extinguish. I was not a nobody. I was the only child of Richard Vance, the man who could buy and sell the entire Sterling bloodline before breakfast. Beatrice was the first to attempt damage control. Her face, which had been a mask of terror just seconds ago, twisted into a grotesque imitation of a welcoming smile. She stepped over the shattered glass of her wine goblet, extending trembling hands toward my father. "Richard, Mr. Vance," she stammered, her voice pitching too high. This is a delightful surprise. We had no idea if we had known Sarah was your daughter. Obviously, things would have been different. This is all just a terrible family misunderstanding. We were just testing her resilience. You know how it is in our circles." "Silence," Richard said. He did not shout. He did not have to. The word was spoken with such absolute finality that Beatrice's mouth snapped shut. He reached out and gently touched the silver locket that hung around my neck, a piece of jewelry I had worn every day since my 21st birthday. "You were not testing her," my father said, his voice ice cold. "You were torturing her." And I heard every single word. Beatrice paled. "You heard this locket," Richard explained, addressing the room while keeping his hand on my shoulder, "contains a high-fidelity transmitter. I have listened to every insult you threw at her for the past 3 months. I heard you call her a parasite. I heard you threaten to steal her child. I let Sarah live her life because she wanted to find someone who loved her for herself, not for the Vance billions. She wanted to be Sarah, the writer, not Sarah Vance, the heiress." He turned his gaze to Mark. My ex-husband was slumped in his chair, looking as if he had been gutted. His face was a shade of gray I had never seen before. He looked from me to Richard, the realization crashing down on him. He had not just divorced a wife. He had divorced the greatest fortune in New York. He had thrown away a woman who truly loved him, and in doing so, he had thrown away the very power and status he had sacrificed me to keep. "Sarah," Mark whispered, reaching a shaking hand toward me across the table. "I didn't know. I swear." "That is the point. Mark," I said, my voice steady. "You didn't know. And because you didn't know, you showed me exactly who you are." Before Mark could respond, a second man in a dark suit walked into the room. He carried a leather briefcase and moved with the shark-like efficiency of a corporate executioner. It was Arthur Stone, the chief legal counsel for Vance Global. He walked straight to the table and slammed a thick blue folder directly on top of the divorce papers I had just signed. The sound was heavy and final. "What is this?" Beatrice asked, her voice trembling. "That," Richard said, a predatory smile finally touching his lips, "is the foreclosure notice." "Foreclosure." Beatrice laughed nervously. "Do not be ridiculous. Sterling Industries is solvent." "Sterling Industries was struggling," Richard corrected her. "You were over-leveraged. You had millions in toxic debt spread across 3 different shell companies to hide your losses. My analysts found them 4 months ago. And for the last 3 months. While you were busy planning how to destroy my daughter, I was busy buying every single one of your debts." He leaned forward, placing both hands on the table. I own your loans. Beatrice, I own your mortgage. I own the notes on this house, the yacht, and the company headquarters. And as of 9 o'clock this morning, I called in the debt. No. Beatrice gasped, grabbing the blue folder and tearing it open. Her eyes scanned the pages frantically, her breathing becoming short and ragged. This is impossible. You cannot do this. We have 30 days to cure the default. Read paragraph 4. Arthur Stone said calmly, "The cross-default clause. Once you missed the payment to the Cayman subsidiary, which you did yesterday, the entire $300 million became due immediately." Beatrice let out a scream of pure frustration and threw the papers into the air. They fluttered down like snow, landing on the uneaten turkey and the terrified guests. "I am the majority shareholder," she shrieked, her composure completely gone. "I control this company not anymore," Richard said softly. "You are bankrupt, Beatrice, and you are trespassing on my property. But bankruptcy is just the beginning," Richard continued, his voice cutting through the panic in the room like a razor. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a flash drive, holding it up for everyone to see. "You were so confident that Sarah was a simpleton that you let her organize your home office. You let her file your bank statements. You let her handle the logistics for your so-called charity auctions." Beatrice's eyes bulged. She looked at me, betrayal warring with fear on her face. I remembered those days. I had spent hours sorting through receipts and ledgers, trying to be helpful, trying to earn her approval. I had no idea at the time that the numbers did not add up. But I had digitized everything to be efficient. My father's forensic accountants had clearly found what I had missed. "Those files prove systemic embezzlement," Richard declared. "You have been funneling investor money into offshore accounts for 5 years to maintain this lifestyle. You stole over $10 million from the company pension fund alone." As if on cue, the heavy thud of boots echoed from the hallway. The double doors were thrown open again, but this time it was not private security. It was a squad of federal agents in windbreakers emblazoned with the letters FBI. The contrast between their tactical gear and the room's gold leaf decor was jarring. Beatrice Sterling, a lead agent, shouted, stepping forward with a warrant in his hand. "You are under arrest for securities fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement. Place your hands on the table where I can see them." The room erupted. Aunt Clara shrieked and dropped her purse. The hedge fund manager tried to inch away from the table, looking like he wanted to dive through the window. Beatrice stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. 2 agents moved in on her, grabbing her arms roughly. The velvet of her gown bunched up under their grip. "Get your hands off me," Beatrice screamed, struggling uselessly. "Do you know who I am? This is a mistake. My son. Mark, do something." But Mark was not looking at his mother. He was scrambling out of his chair, stumbling over his own feet to get to me. He fell to his knees beside my chair, grabbing the hem of the coat my father had draped over me. "Sarah," Mark blubbered, tears streaming down his face. "Sarah, you have to stop this. You know I didn't mean those things. She made me do it." She threatened to cut me off. "I love you, I swear to God. I love you and the baby." I looked down at him. The man I had shared a bed with, the man I had envisioned growing old with, was now groveling on the floor. He looked pathetic. He looked small. "Get up, Mark," I said softly. "Tell them," he begged, clutching my hand with sweaty palms. "Tell your father to stop. We can fix this. We can be a family again. I will be a good father. Please." I gently pried his fingers off my hand, one by one. I felt no anger anymore. The rage had burned itself out, leaving behind only a cold, hollow pity. "You do not love me, Mark," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "And you do not love our child. You only love your own safety. You only love the comfort of this house. You are not a victim. You are just a coward who bet on the wrong horse." Mark collapsed back onto his heels, sobbing into his hands. Richard stepped forward, checking his watch, a timepiece that probably cost more than the sterling's remaining net worth. "This property now belongs to Vance Global Bank," my father announced, his voice booming over the sound of Beatrice's shrieking. "You are all trespassing. I am giving every person in this room exactly 1 hour to remove your personal effects and vacate the premises. Anyone found on the grounds after 60 minutes will be arrested for trespassing." Total chaos broke out. The veneer of high society shattered instantly. People who had been politely sipping wine 5 minutes ago were now shoving each other to get to the door. "I told you this would happen," Uncle Julian yelled at Beatrice as he ran past her. "I told you the books were cooked. You signed off on them, you idiot." Beatrice screamed back as the agents wrestled her arms behind her back. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut cut through the noise. Click, click, click. It was the sound of an empire ending. Beatrice was hauled away, her expensive heels dragging on the carpet, her hair coming loose from its perfect bun. She looked back at me one last time, her eyes filled with hate. But I just watched her go. The Queen of the Hamptons was being dragged out of her castle in chains, leaving behind nothing but broken glass and the ruin of her own making. The chaos in the dining room had settled into a grim, bureaucratic silence. Agents were already tagging the antique furniture with evidence stickers, and the guests had fled into the snowy night like rats abandoning a sinking ship. I reached across the stained tablecloth and snatched up the divorce decree I had signed under duress. The ink was barely dry, but the person who signed it, that scared, desperate girl, was gone. Mark looked up from the floor, his eyes red and swollen. For a brief second, a flicker of pathetic hope crossed his face, as if he thought I might be reconsidering the separation. "Sarah," he croaked, his voice raw. I looked at him with zero emotion. I ripped the heavy cream paper down the middle. The sound of tearing paper was sharp and satisfying. I stacked the halves and tore them again, letting the confetti pieces rain down onto the empty plate where his Thanksgiving dinner should have been. "I am not filing this version," I told him, my voice calm and final. "My legal team will draft a new agreement. The terms will be mine. You will not get alimony. You will not get a settlement. And you will certainly never see full custody of my son." Mark opened his mouth to protest, but no sound came out. He looked around the empty room. His mother was in the back of a federal vehicle. His house was foreclosed. His wife was leaving. He was completely, utterly alone in the ruin he had helped create. I turned my back on him and took my father's arm. "Let us go." "Dad," I said. Richard Vance nodded, his face grim as he guided me through the hallway. We walked past the portraits of the Sterling ancestors, whose judgmental stares seemed to have lost all their power. We stepped out the massive front doors and into the biting cold of the Hamptons' night. The storm was still raging, but the biting wind felt cleansing against my skin, scrubbing away the toxicity of the last 2 years. A long, sleek black limousine was idling at the foot of the stone steps, its engine purring softly, a stark contrast to the aggressive roar of the helicopter that had brought my salvation. A driver held the door open, shielding us from the snow with a large umbrella. Before I stepped inside, I stopped. I turned back to look at Sterling Manor one last time. The lights were still on, blazing gold against the dark sky, but I knew the warmth inside was fake. It was a beautiful, rotting mausoleum. I waited for the pang of sadness, the ache of lost love, but it never came. Instead, I felt a profound, quiet peace. The heavy weight that had been crushing my chest for months had simply evaporated. "You never have to look at that place again," Richard said gently, squeezing my hand. "I promise you, Sarah." I will spend the rest of my life making up for the time I let you suffer. You and my grandson will have everything, not just money, but safety, love, a real family. I looked up at my father, seeing the tears standing in his own eyes, and I nodded. I ducked into the warm, leather-scented interior of the car. As the door clicked shut, sealing out the wind and the noise, I settled back into the soft seat. I placed both hands over my belly, feeling the rhythmic, strong movement of my son. He was calm now, as if he knew the danger had passed. "We are going home, little one," I whispered to him, a smile touching my lips. "We are going home, a real home." The car pulled away smoothly, the tires crunching over the snow. I did not look out the back window. I rested my head on my father's shoulder, closing my eyes as we left the wreckage of the Sterling dynasty fading into the whiteout behind us. The road ahead was dark, but for the first time in a long time, I was not afraid of the journey. I was ready. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I hope you enjoyed seeing justice served as much as I enjoyed sharing it. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Please drop a comment below and let's get a conversation started. If you want to hear more satisfying stories like this, please make sure to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and smash that hype button to help this story reach more people. Your support means the world to me.